The final form of writing which I want to deal with in this module is I've called philosophical argument. Now the word philosophical sounds very grand and very difficult, but in fact we do philosophical argument every day. The word philosophy comes again from Greek, and it comes from two Greek words. The first word is philo or philos, which means to be a friend or a lover of. So let's call it a friend. And sophi or sophos, which means wisdom. So philosophy is to be a friend of wisdom. Now, again, that's not really all that much more help. Essentially, what philosophy is about argument. And you may see that there's a philosophical argument going on all the time in terms of our lives. We're constantly in a particular form of philosophy. Every time you have a discussion with a child who wants something, you enter into a philosophical argument. Because the child says, I want this, and you say, no, you can't have it. At which point the child will respond with, well, why can't I have it? At which point as a parent you'll say, well, it's too expensive, it's not good for you, you've already got one, you broke the last one. And so we offer arguments. And each time we offer an argument, the child will respond with a counter-argument. And after the counter-argument, we then respond, and so we argue. It's the same concept in philosophy. And so in philosophy is developing the arguments about the big questions of things. Is that, how does this work? Why did this happen? When is this connected with? It's not the scientific arguments which look at experimentation, but rather the philosophical, the thought arguments, the thinking arguments of life. Now, the Bible doesn't come into a vacuum. It comes into a highly philosophical space. Some of the greatest philosophers which are still used today, are still the underpinning of so much of argument in the West, were Greek philosophers. The two most well-known ones was a man by the name of Plato and another one called Aristotle. Both of these men were disciples of another well-known philosopher called Socrates. And together what they began to do is find different ways of doing argument, different ways of seeing the world, different ways of perceiving how the world works. Now, together, these philosophers could be thought of as the Greek philosophers, as the guys who come from that Western perspective. But of course, there wasn't only Greek philosophy. There were philosophy of the other parts of the world as well. And in fact, Jewish philosophy was there as well. And we can see Jewish philosophy within a lot of the Tanakh, the way in which they perceive God and they perceive the world. And often when we read it, we feel that, no, that's wrong. That's not how I see the world. And that's right. Because often the way in which you see the world is influenced by your philosophy, by your understanding, by your thinking. Now, the Bible is filled then with philosophy, whether it be Greek philosophy, whether it be Jewish philosophy. And where this comes to a head is in the writings of Paul. Paul was obviously well versed in both sides of the philosophical debate. He was both a Greek taught philosopher. He knew Greek philosophy. When we read the story of him going to Athens and they're going onto this mount called the Mount of Areopagus or Mars Hill, he then starts arguing with two groups, the Epicureans and the Stoics, both of them kind of stables of philosophy. He's able to quote their own philosophers back to them, showing that obviously Paul was well read in Greek philosophy. But on the other hand, we also read that he was trained by a rabbi in Jerusalem called Gamaliel. And so therefore in Jerusalem he would have learned Jewish philosophy. And so what we see in Paul is this mixture of both Jewish thinking and Greek thinking together. And of course that's what makes so much of Paul so difficult for us to understand. For the lay person, when we read books like Romans, when we read books like Thessalonians, we read it and we say, well, what is he on about? Well, what we need to realize is that what he's doing is he's doing philosophical argument. He would state a concept like the resurrection of the dead or like the concept of faith and of salvation. And what he would then do is he's arguing his point. He's then explaining how he gets to that point. If we read the book of Galatians or the letter to the Galatians, we see the same thing. He's arguing to the people in Galatia that these Gentiles do not first have to become Jews in order to become Christians. And the reason why he says that is because he says, in the end, Abraham is the one that we connect with. If we go right back to Abraham, then we realize that we don't need to worry about Moses. We don't have to go through the law first. We just need to connect with God. And so therefore these Gentiles can connect with God, and therefore they can become Christians without going through the Mosaic law, without going through circumcision and all the other rites of passage into Judaism. In each of those, Paul is using philosophical argument. But of course, it's that philosophical argument that makes it so difficult to read Paul. It's so much easier to read the gospel writings, or at least it's seemingly easier to read the gospel writings because they seem to be more obvious. They're things that we can hold on to. I want to encourage you, though, to imagine always thinking in terms of argument. That what Paul's trying to do is he's trying to convince using thinking and using argument to try and convince you of his perspective. And when he does that, that's how we can begin to get an insight into where is he going. Sometimes it's even good to write down some of the phrases of the argument so we can see how he's constructed it, how he's put it together, and what he's trying to prove, what he's trying to understand. Of course, if you have a knowledge of both Greek and Hebrew philosophy, that certainly is helpful in understanding Paul. Because otherwise what often happens is we misunderstand Paul, is we begin to think in terms only of today for Paul, rather than to think of the context in which Paul himself was living. Philosophical argument will always be the hardest part of Scripture. But if you persevere, if you keep reading and keep growing with it, I guarantee that it will begin to open up for you. And we can begin to get a better appreciation of Paul and of the writers of the Hebrews, for example. Their particular way of arguing and their particular way of trying to share their understanding of the relationship with Jesus.